Thank you very much, and thank you for your generous comments. And let me just start by saying that this is my 6th time as secretary appearing in front of this hearing, and I don't think I've ever heard better testimony than the video of Zeke Grater just a moment ago, and I hope the family lets you use that in the future, because I think it's a call to arms, and a call to arms with a realistic perspective of how people work together, and the notion of environmentalism and recognizing the blue-collar community, of the call for diversity, of other people to see past their point of view to what a broader issue is and a coalition in just dealing with these issues. There could have been no better tribute than his own words at the start of this. And when I worked with Zeke in the 1980s as a mayor of a coastal city, and we were working together against an imminent threat of offshore oil that year, it was exactly as that video just said. He wanted to make sure, even though we were working in complete coalition, that we understood beyond just what our concerns were and what the concerns were of the industry and the people he worked with, so that going forward, they would hear that in whatever we said about the issue. And it was just incredible leadership. I consulted him in the last decade, and I have to say, as Resources Secretary, he was not 100% in sync all the time, and yet it was for the right reason. And it was because he would say, whatever we were working on at a moment, that isn't the only solution. It really needs to be a broad base of dealing with coastal issues, whether it's acidification or fisheries restoration or debris or threats from climate change. All those things were things that had to be dealt with, and it was also helpful, and he will really be missed, and I should probably borrow that video so that I can just play it at times that I need the appropriate guidance in what I do. And it's been my role in recent years, because you have an ambitious agenda, you have many people coming after this, to sort of just talk about some of the major challenges right now that everybody else will talk about on the ground and in more detail as you move through the day. And obviously, you mentioned what I think is the top priority, which is the challenge this year to the crab industry and the crab fisheries and what is happening. And as you referenced, on Tuesday, the governor sent the letter to Secretary Pritzker, because Commerce has NOAA, asking for the declaration. It really declaring a commercial failure will enable the fishing communities impacted by the closure to receive vital financial assistance, and it's urgently needed to help them recover. And I think part of the difficulty is sometimes at the federal level, you have to be fully through the season to recognize the disaster, and I think we wanted to ask before that. So it's in front of them, it's on their plate, they do whatever work they need to move as expeditiously as possible in responding. And also on February 3rd, the Small Business Administration announced low-interest disaster loans are available. And we really hope that as we monitor that process, that it really helps people, it gets out the door in an expeditious fashion and in a way that is truly helpful. And I also should say, as chair of the Ocean Protection Council, we are very much concerned about resilient fisheries in California and the industry. And last week, we had a hearing that was an informational hearing on what is going on with the harmful algal bloom together with the acidification. We had a professor from UC Santa Cruz together with people from Fish and Wildlife and OWIHA and the Department of Health laying it out. And it was a rather scary picture. What's happened off of the Mendocino coast with the starvation of oxygen to some basic species is a disaster by itself. And so I have appointed or asked that we convene an interagency working group that are representatives from all those departments to try to be able to better predict when and where these blooms will form, invest in the science needed to better understand the toxins, and not have to do that after it hits, but so that we can try to figure out over the long term how we're going to deal about this, how we will know everything that we need to know in being able to take steps. On another issue, 2 weeks ago, the states of Oregon and California and the Secretaries of Interior and Commerce signed an agreement in principle on Klamath Dam removal. And there was some confusion because there were two agreements. There was the agreement that really was the one with regard to restoration and a global agreement, and Congress needed to have acted by the first of the year, and they didn't. But secondly, there was a hydroelectric agreement, and that survives, and that is in force. So this agreement in principle will require the parties to see if we can get to a final agreement in a reasonable amount of time. And the important thing is here is the serious impacts to juvenile run salmon, particularly this year, removing the barriers over time, we hope will not lead to the situation that existed roughly 13 and 14 years ago in the basin with a massive fish die-off. And I think people focus on just what the water supply issues are here and not the fact that there is a companion issue about the fish runs. And there was even some challenging when I went up to Klamath Falls and signed the update of the agreement with the Secretary of Interior and Governor of Oregon and others over not understanding that give and take. Some people were giving up pieces of their water in order to guarantee fish, and people didn't understand why they might be giving up water to which they were entitled. It was the trade-off to get fish runs back in protected in a significant way. So we are now working with the stakeholders to move to the next step. There, in the governor's proposed budget, there is the money to deal with the dam removal out of Proposition 1. It will be considered by the legislature. And we are actually working with Oregon and the federal government to try to find a path toward reconstituting the larger basin-wide settlements and the agreements that need to be taken. On another issue, which I loosely alluded to, but the changing ocean conditions in general, in this very room, a few weeks ago, Senator Pavley convened a hearing on acidification and hypoxia, and I was the lead witness at that, where she really was trying to focus on what actionable items might be and call attention to what the actual situation is in the changing conditions. And there is a panel that has been convened, and we convened originally acidification and hypoxia panel of scientists. It was broadened to include Washington and Oregon. It is expected to make a report in early April. Now other states across the country are looking to the West Coast to see what we're doing and what they might do. And one of the interesting things is at that hearing, there was one person on the panel that questioned the climate science with regard to acidification. And it was the next day that I was in Seattle with at a major oceans meeting where people described in detail what's going on in the Puget Sound, how certain aquaculture concerns are having a rough time and having to deal with the acidification in their very operations to try to just continue them, and had some reversals before they truly understood what was happening. So this is a real issue, that's changing, and it comes from two things. It comes from certain nearshore activities, but it comes from greenhouse gas emissions and the changing acidification in the ocean. And so we will be working, when this report comes out, to educate people as to what things there might be true and what steps people can take. And obviously, when you look at just lowering greenhouse gas emissions, in this case, that is one of the most major things you can do to deal with acidification in the ocean, and a lot of people do not make that link. And we will have a scientific basis for actions when this report comes out. Additionally, the baseline science for the different areas on the marine protected areas is nearing completion. The North Coast is the one that is still in process, and the first results are in on what is going on, and particularly in the Channel Islands, which was done in advance of the 4 areas. The science is showing that basically fish species are bigger and more plentiful inside the areas as opposed to outside. Anecdotally, people are parking just outside the reserve in the Channel Island and fishing there, and they're getting bigger catches. And to talk sort of at a layperson's level about what the science is, you would think that fish move regularly and that reserving areas might not catch them on an ongoing basis. They really live in the neighborhood. And so they're really finding that they are getting bigger and fatter in the first days into areas that are protected. And so I think that we want to constantly be transparent on the science. And then also, if there's adaptive management, if we have to adjust what was done in the protected areas based on what we are finding, we want to be prepared to do that. And then lastly, just the governor did last year an additional executive order on greenhouse gases and adaptation, and directed the Resources Agency to continue its work at faster intervals on resiliency, and we will have a report out relating to sea level rise, climate change, appropriate activities, or what is judged, and that is working its way through the process. Safeguarding California was released, I believe, the year before last, had a section, but the governor wants to make sure that we constantly move ahead and constantly update and constantly give guidance to local governments and others so that they can plan. And as somebody that was a mayor of a coastal city that had an entire water system and sewer system that was gravity flow attuned to the current level of the ocean, if you make an investment in systems like that are 50 or 75 years ahead, you have to be taking into account the changes that will be happening. And that's what we want to do, work in partnership with the local governments to do. With that, that's just an overview of some of the major things we're working on. I know you'll get details behind, and I really appreciate the chance to open your hearing today.
Mr. Secretary, we are always grateful that you take the time. I know that you have a very busy schedule, so to be able to be here today and to join us last night at the annual reception, we're grateful and truly appreciate all your work, both in the legislature and now as Secretary. I have a couple questions, but I wanted to be able to see if any of the members have any questions for the Secretary. And just a reminder for folks, we heard the Secretary talk about the governor's request. Director Bonham from Fish and Wildlife is going to go in depth on that. And we also do have Dr. Anderson from UC Santa Cruz, who's here today, who's going to go in depth on all issues in regards to the algae blooms and the impacts that we've been seeing on West Coast fisheries right after Director Bonham. One item in regards to the blooms, and this has been an issue that industry wants to be able to focus in on. This is an unprecedented closure. We have never seen anything like this, at least in modern history. And funding science to get a better understanding of domoic acid. We had one outbreak in the late 70s in the Great Lake region where we actually had 3 individuals pass away from eating shellfish. But since then, we have not had a whole lot of research on domoic acid and the impacts, and obviously domoic acid is caused by those blooms. So wanting to be able to work with the administration along with the department on how we could potentially look at funding some research so we can become more proactive, particularly on issues of levels and what really makes sense when it comes to crab. Your thoughts on that?
We would absolutely work together. There's going to be real attempts to do exactly what you said. And I have to say, you thanked me for coming last night, and the benefit was about 40 informal conversations with people. And there was somebody who's probably sitting behind me right now who said, well, you got to make sure you ask us. We're there. We have the science. We've been doing different readings, even if it hasn't been incorporated into what the official people have done. That was a good reminder to me, and I'm going to try to make sure that there's outreach to make sure that if anybody is documenting anything on the ground, that we have the benefit of that in whatever we do.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Mr. Ting?
I think just to follow up on that conversation, I think I had conversations as well last night. I think there was a concern shared by other fellow people that the baseline standard may be somewhat of an antiquated standard on domoic acid. So trying to understand that given the seriousness of actually shutting down the industry for a year, and obviously with the governor declaring the state of emergency, are there ways that we can make sure that we're using the right standard, as well as, obviously working with the industry to make sure that obviously what they're serving is safe, but at the same time that we're also not being, overly punitive at the same time as well.
You're exactly right, because the very same conversation I just referenced, that came up last night. And I was pointing out that I had this unfortunate experience in my legislative district of them changing the detection levels and the science in the first month I was in the assembly on perchlorate. And suddenly there were plumes below 1,500 private wells in my legislative district, and it all revolved around what you just said, which was the levels that were set for what constituted harm. And it was a difficult process because it was the result of science, but it was applied broadly, and there might be different experiences in sort of how it happened in different places in the state or the West Coast, and trying to impact that process, whether it's done scientifically through a WEHA, the Environmental Protection Agency at the state level, or the federal agencies. It's not always an easy thing. And so I think that was the wake-up call that came yesterday, is taking a look at that and just seeing, because I think I've had the misfortune of being involved in the gas leak in Los Angeles the last few weeks and going to a couple of huge town halls, and there's skepticism in the public about whether or not science is being done in the right places at the right level that tells them what they need to know in the minute, and that applies to this as well. So I just thought last night, point well taken, and we will look into this.
Thank you so much.
I think at the same time, we also know that as we've moved to more sustainable methods in agriculture, I think we're also going to have to explore the same in this industry as well, too.
Thank you, Mr. Ting. Any other questions for the Secretary? I think obviously the item is just, and I understand it's complicated in regards to salmon runs, particularly during the summer. But I know you mentioned there is a dual approach, but water temperature really was significant. I know there was a lot of pressures because of the state's historic drought. And we just saw tremendous die-off, which is going to impact in the years to come. So I think that's another item that we're going to need to continue to work together.
Well, the one thing is there was a big, whatever the word is, hoo-ha, over how the temperature measurements were taken in Lake Shasta last year.
Right.
And it changed the water that was scheduled to be released and held a lot back, but there was a question about whether it, in fact, by the time that happened, affected the temperature. And I think we want to be able to work with whatever agency, whether they're federal or ones that aren't in the resources agency, to try to deal with whatever equipment or things are necessary to just make sure that you don't have that unfold the way it did last year.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Anything else for the Secretary? We're
Thank
grateful
you.
for your time. It's so good to see you, sir. Thank you. And again, thank you so much for coming. We're going to call Director Bonham up. I want to just take a moment to say thank you to Director Bonham. He is one of the busiest individuals here in the Capitol, and there are very few issues that are not controversial that end up in his on his plate. And as we were talking last night, just want to say thank you to Fish and Wildlife. You've been all over the issue of the closure, and I appreciate your work personally for working with the governor's office to be able to advance that declaration. We're really grateful for that and appreciate it. And before the director speaks, we referenced the reception last night, and I think on behalf of the committee, we want to say thank you to everyone who worked so hard on the reception. I did see the director with 2 plates, which was fantastic. But hey, there we go. Hey, that's what I was saying. But again, thank you so much for all your work. So without further ado, Director Bonham is going to be addressing several issues, but his top issue that he's going to be discussing today is on the delay of the Dungeness crab season. So thank you, Mr. Director.
Yes. Thank you, Assembly Member, or Senator and Assembly Member, for your leadership on this committee, other committee members. I'd like to save crab to the very end. I expect we'll have a lot of detailed questions there. And I, too, must start with an acknowledgement about Zeke, who embodies one word for me, stewardship. And his words in the video actually describe what I think is stewardship, this responsibility to take our resources and pass them to the next generation in no worse state, hopefully better. And I spent many hours with Zeke driving down to Fresno in the San Joaquin region to work with farmers to see if we could bring back the West Coast southernmost spring Chinook run. And I also spent many hours working with Zeke on restoring the Klamath River, including going through the West Coast's largest fish kill ever there in the early to mid 2000s. So I'm often thinking about what I should do in my job relative to what I learned from him. And it saddens me that we have the state we have now in salmon because I feel I'm not living up to my responsibility to him. So let me turn to many of the things we're doing in the state. We have submitted our annual fisheries report to you. It kind of gives the background on landings across all our fisheries through 2014. We don't have our 15 data in yet, but when we do, of course, we'll be producing next year's annual report. I got to start by just saying something's going on in the ocean, and it's not right. And it doesn't fit our historical understandings. We have abnormal conditions, whether you're thinking about how our drought situation relates to ocean, whether you're thinking about the so-called warm water blob, whether you're thinking about El Nino. And what we see are examples of that change affecting our ecology and our biology. We've had an increase in observed whale entanglements. You mentioned that earlier. We've had a widespread sea star wasting disease outbreak. We've actually lost most of that species. We've closed our sardine fishery. And we're talking about things in the last couple of years, 2011 to 14 or 15. We've seen a marked decrease in market squid landings. And I got a briefing yesterday from one of our doctors, and we have seen a significant and widespread loss of bull kelp habitat north of San Francisco. And it directly relates to your coast in Mendocino and Sonoma. It's gone. Gone to a large extent. And as a result, we've lost most of our red urchins. And our scientists are claiming these mile-long stretches of the North Coast to be urchin barrens. They've gone from abundance to scarcity in several years. We're seeing warm water species like wahoo show up farther north in greater numbers than we've ever seen before, and we're seeing, for the first time, very never seen before, things like sea snakes washing up on Southern California beaches. This should be an exclamation alarm to the general public to stay aware and engaged in this ecological change that's going on in the ocean. It's been a crazy year. We may not remember that just in May of last year, we had an oil spill, the Refugio oil spill, north of Santa Barbara, which was the biggest spill in 25 years in the state. I'm sad we had the event. I'm pleased to report we're moving through the healing process. We're well engaged in the natural resource damage assessment effort. We'll be asking the company to settle for restoration or pursuing our option to litigate. We're going out to the local communities down there asking for feedback on the restoration projects that would be done to mitigate the harm. We're well into our subsequent last phases of the monitoring to track whether these storms will resurface oil related to the spill. But it's not been all doom and gloom. We've rolled out electronic logbooks. Go figure. It's taken until 2016 to move our paper receipt structure to electronic. With the commercial fleet in Southern California, in partnership with our anglers, it's a huge success. We've managed to expand our recreational Pacific halibut fishery. So we got California more allocation for Pacific halibut, which is really relevant for folks up in Humboldt. And we've stayed within our quota and our agreements with our northern states that if they gave us more, we wouldn't go over limit. That's a great success story. Our federal trawl surveys are observing the highest pelagic rockfish catches in about 32 years worth of survey. So that gives us some hope for young of the year sardine and anchovies and a rebound there. What are we going to be doing in 16? I'll get to crab at the end. We're thankful for your leadership on whale entanglements and the industry's engagement with the conservation community. I see great promise for us sorting out a better way on entanglements. We're working on the aspect of a state-conforming package to what's going on in federal waters, which is really restricting large-scale, kind of wholesale commercial harvesting of our important forage fisheries. I think that's a good conservation outcome. We're probably going to have our first state-based fisheries management plan in over a decade. We're on the brink of completing a state management plan for our spiny lobster fishery. And I think we've been remiss on our side. We have dozens of state-only species, and we haven't produced management plans. So Dr. Craig Schumann, our Marine Ranger, we're turning our attention to completing lobster and then using that template and marching through our highest, most important state fisheries and putting a plan on it, engaging the industry and the conservation groups. Salmon, not good, and not a favorable outlook. We briefed yesterday our commission. We're right in the cycle with our federal colleagues. It's looking like the 2015 escapement numbers, meaning the fish going out, which you kind of set harvest to, for both the Sacramento and Klamath Falls Chinook are going to be below their target levels. I would predict it's reasonable for industry to be thinking about further restrictions on ocean catch as we're seeing degraded stocks. And of course, we've had national focus on the Sacramento winter run, which I'll just say is an existential, it really raises the existential threat of extinction. They're 3-year cycle fish. You use 2 years of your young with 95% or greater mortality in the egg level, and you're getting in a catastrophic scenario. Look, it's water allocation in part, but we also have to always remember so many parts of California are demanding from that limited pool of cold water in Shasta. Sometimes of the year, we need to move volumes out in the winter and fall for our estuary fish. Sometimes of year, really old water rights and agricultural contracting districts call on that water for rice in the Central Valley. We've got people who drink it, and then we're working hard to save enough of it for the late summer and fall that we can keep temperatures low in that stretch of river. And it's caused us to do things like close to recreational angling, the 5.5-mile stretch from Redding downstream, which is one of my personal favorite trout fisheries on the planet. So the impact's real. Ground fish, we're going to keep rebuilding those overfished stocks, and we're actually seeing that rockfish and petroleum sole have rebuilt ahead of schedule. So we're anticipating hopefully some moderately increased harvest opportunity in our ground fish. Swordfish, we've got a big bycatch reduction and alternative gear development debate underway between our stakeholders. We're in the middle between a lot of disparate views. Our federal council has put a hard cap on our drift gillnet fishery related to this bycatch question. Let me turn to crab. and take a little bit of time there, if it's okay. I cannot wait this year or next to the moment each of you invites me to Fisherman's Wharf or up to Fort Bragg, and we have some good California Dungeness crab and perhaps, dare I say, an adult beverage. I look forward to that. I really miss having taken my son, who's 4 years old, to our local fish market. Shout out to Paul Johnson in Berkeley. And bought it for our holiday season like we always do. So I know that this is real to your constituents. I think we've done a suite of activities over the fall through today on the administration front. As we got into October and November, our department really ramped up our coordination with the Department of Public Health and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. We began to talk to some of the potentially affected crabbers. As we moved into the beginning of November, and after public health in coordination with OWEA declared a public health risk, my department and our Fish and Game Commission, in like 48 hours, working with the Office of Administrative Law, turned around emergency regulations, which is breakneck pace for rulemaking. Then we've stayed engaged, testing and monitoring, relying on our commercial fishermen and women to go out in sometimes difficult waters and bring in the samples. You asked me to come to Santa Rosa in December. I told you then that our department would go ahead and start making the case for advancing a disaster request. We've been building that. It's only at the January 15 mark that we crossed all of our historical precedent. We've delayed the opener until January 15 twice, 2012 and 13. Totally different reasons, quality of meat. But it's not till we got to mid-January that we've had a sense of new territory, if you will, around closure. And we're continually struggling with this. As we're looking at the samples that are coming in, we're seeing a trend towards clean. But every moment we think we're at the potential for a second week of clean to open, we'll get a hot sample and we reboot to test for 2 clean weeks again. And we've bumped up against that a couple of times now. So as we came into the end of January, I think we felt very comfortable with our data on the department front, which is why you'll see at the beginning of February, Director of Emergency Services for the state, Mr. Ghilarducci, requested from the Small Business Administration the SBA loan program, which is now available in 15 counties. And then on Tuesday, we see the governor writing to Secretary Pritzker. So here's what the governor did in that letter. The 2 controlling federal statutes on fisheries management are, I think it's the 1986 Interjurisdictional Fisheries Act, and then what we all call in the field the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It has a longer title. Both of them relate to this idea of a commercial failure or a fishery resource disaster. My personal view, they're not easy to decipher. They use a lot of the same terms of art, and they kind of commingle the use. But here's the bottom line takeaway. The state has now asked the Secretary of Commerce to declare a commercial failure under one of the statutes, and under the other statute, a fishery resource disaster. If this goes as I hope it goes, the next step will be the federal relevant agency, NOAA Fisheries, National Marine Fisheries Service, calls us. We start now continuing to go through the analytical case and preparing the data, which I believe will show these declarations are warranted. We already know, because you can look at the last 5 years, which is the formula we're supposed to use, of the monthly landings, and we can take an average, and this is ex-vessel direct. It's not all the other potential impact. So the value of the product at the wharf, first price, times pounds. and we can run the months, we already know staying closed through the end of January means there's at least a $48.3 million direct impact on Dungeness. And we also made this request for rock crab. We can't forget our rock crab commercial fishermen and women. There, the impact, we think, is about $385,000. So for Dungeness, we believe we've already seen a 71% impact relative to the annual 5-year running. And I think on rock crab, we believe it is 37%. And if you go over to the federal statutes and regulations, you'll see breakouts on those percentages. And as you get really close to 80% or just above, it's almost mandatory that the Commerce Department considers it to qualify for these kinds of determinations. Okay. So I hope the Secretary federally directs her agency to work with us. We will expeditiously go through the analytics with them. Then my next hoped-for step will be that she affirmatively declares a failure and a disaster, respectively. At which point, honestly, this really does become about congressional appropriations. I've been in public interest my whole life. I don't have enough money to be a gambler. I would not advise anybody to gamble on how the congressional appropriations world works. But I'm very confident that we have leadership in our delegation, Mr. Huffman, Ms. Capps, Ms. Spear, Mr. Farr, who can lead this debate and champion relief through the congressional appropriations cycle. That's how I see this playing out. If I could script it, I would make sure it happened as soon as possible. But I think we need to be very careful in controlling expectations. It's not as if because the governor sent the letter Tuesday, there's relief assistance available Friday. Here's the last issue I'd cover on crab and then stop for questions. I believe there is one next big unresolved hurdle for this year and one very big responsibility on my shoulders personally when we get into the space that's on the other side of, I hope, a affirmative federal result. Here's what I still think is an unresolved hurdle for us. Our department and the commission have closed recreational and commercial fishing for these species because of a public health risk. When the public health agencies in their expertise conclude that risk no longer exists, the industry is going to ask, are you opening or not? I don't think they're of a unanimous view. It's rare that, in my experience, crabbers agree on much of anything. And I think they'll have a healthy debate on this question. I will tell you personally, if there's but one boat within the 500 or 600 permitted boats, and that one boat wants to go fishing, how can I rob them of their right? So we've got that debate ahead of us. We will remain engaged with the task force, and we've got to sort it out together. Here's what I want to do personally once we get into calmer waters. I think we should, at our department, take as many lessons learned as possible. I think I should personally call the Director of Public Health and OWIA. I think we should use the space from this late spring through next year, take advice from the affected industry, look at what would be a more ideal sampling program, what would be our frequency, what would be our emphasis on data collection, what should be our outreach and education structure as you come into any given fall before we deal with November questions. So that if we see this bloom again, this is my greatest fear. This is not a one-off. And we're right back in this same situation because of domoic acid next year. So I want personally to use these 8 months also to be improving our systems. I don't have specificity on what that's going to mean, but I expect you're going to keep asking me about that through a whole bunch of hearings, budget or otherwise. I also think it's incumbent on us to keep pursuing stewardship as Zeke advises us, that includes reforming our practices as we're learning. Let me stop there.